Ads schmads. If you don't want ads, that's okay. Choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And hey presto, no ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you? It is time for the podcast, and we have a strange, but I think very interesting podcast for you. I find myself in Quebec City. And if you have ever been in Quebec, you will know that this city it's a very special place. It's a very, very special place. It's architecturally very, very European. It's built up on a hill, very inclement weather most of the year, freezing cold winters, roasting hot summers. But the most exceptional thing is the vibrancy of French-Canadian culture, the vibrancy of the language, the vibrancy of all things français, Jean. How are you? Ça va, mon mec?
Très bien.
Nous sommes ici à Quebec City. Oh, my French, John, you'd be hilarious. My brutal school French.
I hope it's better than mine at this stage.
Well, it's probably. I may be better able to bullshit, right?
well, we know that.
I'm kind of aquaplaning.
You bullshit in
about,
French, though.
I'm aquaplaning with about maximum 60 words, right? Couple of verbs, couple of nouns thrown in there, and we're doing fine. But it really is an exceptional place.
I've never been there, actually. It's one of those kind of places that's on the list. I've got a list the length of my arm at this stage.
Now, the reason I'm here is I did an event in Ottawa the other day, and we're going to actually have a podcast maybe next week, and I'll tell you all about it. The capital city of Canada. Again, very, very beautiful place. And I had 2 days to kick around because I had to do another event in Toronto. So I decided to come here. Really, really well worth it. But, John, on the way to Canada, I had a very traumatic experience I have to share with you.
Go on.
So, as you know, I've been on my travels, right? And I was meant to go from the Caribbean to Ottawa last Sunday to be there on Monday morning. Yeah. And the flights that I had been booked on looked to get me into Ottawa very, very late, like about 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. And I was up on my hind legs at 9 a.m. So I decided what I might try to do is I might try to change those flights and re-divert through the United States. Right. Not a good move. And to go to Tampa, and then from Tampa to Newark, and then from Newark to Ottawa. Okay?
Jeez, that's a bit of a schlep.
It is a bit of a schlep. Not only, it gets worse.
Right.
So I turn up and I get on the flight to Tampa. I have totally and utterly forgotten about a thing called an ESTA visa. Totally forgotten.
Oh, God.
I get on the flight. I arrive in the United States. I go to the queue. It's a pretty long queue at Tampa where, everyone's been very, very friendly. Next, please. And I turn up. And then I give my passport. And the cop says, you've no visa. How did you get on the flight? I said, I kind of walked on. It was like, oh, really? I didn't know. He said, they shouldn't have let you on the flight. I said, okay.
You're a stowaway.
He says, right. He said, you had an ESTA, but it's expired. He said, you're traveling illegally in the United States. Follow me, my friend.
And of course, Mac, this is the reddest of red states, DeSantis country.
Florida is the only place that it gets more southern the more northern you go in the state. So I'm led into the room. You never want to be that bloke. You see him at immigration.
Yeah.
The 2 cops arrive. 2 of them, one on either side of me, and I'm put into a cell. Look, what looked like a kind of a pad room, no windows.
Sitting on the Group W bench with Arlo Guthrie.
Yeah, and it's red plastic seats, and I'm thinking, fuck. How did you get into the United States, sir? Well, you kind of know. I just got off the thing.
This was with the snapping of the blue glove, was it?
I had this fear exactly as he puts on the blue latex glove. It says, bend over, my friend. We have some routine inquiries. No lube, right? So I'm thinking, hold on a second. This could get out of hand. The beginning you're thinking, okay, it's fine. He said, it is a federal offense to enter the United States illegally. And I'm thinking, a state penitentiary for a couple of nights in Tampa, in Florida.
Maybe the sombrero was the giveaway, Mac.
But, it's all coming to me. Narcos, Mexico, Ozarks, the whole thing, it's all coming at once. Scarface, everything, right?
So what happened?
So eventually, a woman comes over to big officer. She sits down And she kind of says, okay, you're illegally, and I could just say, okay, if this is something I can deal with. Because the other cop was very much, I'm going to throw the book at this guy. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
you really thought, I really thought there's 2 or 3 nights in a state penitentiary before you go up in front of a bloody federal judge for illegal entry. That was not the only illegal entry I was contemplating at that time. It was like, oh my good God. And your one just says, look, we will give you an ESTA, an emergency ESTA, and it costs $600. But if
$600?
Yeah. It's a lot, isn't it?
Jesus.
But imagine you didn't have that money. A lot of immigrants coming through wouldn't have that money.
Of course.
So then you end up in the system.
Jesus, if this was the UK, you'd be in Rwanda at this stage.
But I swear to Jesus, John, right? I had, that sort of time when your voice kind of goes, oh, hi.
Yeah.
And your face blanches and you think, oh my good God. Oh my good God. And never have I been so grateful to an American immigration officer who just stamped my passport. Do you know that? The stamp noise? Never have I been so grateful to hear that stamp noise. I mean, I think I lost control of all my bits.
Oh, Mark, that could have gone so horribly wrong.
And the amazing thing is, it didn't go horribly wrong. But that just that moment, we could have been doing the podcast from Tampa State Penitentiary.
No, that would have been good.
My orange jumpsuit. Orange is the new black. Anyway, that's my thing. Let us talk about America, John. Let's do our podcast today, kind of a letter from America. I want us to talk to a new voice on the podcast, one of Canada's most foremost pundits, commentators, journalists, a guy called Evan Solomon, who has just joined a group which is run by a guy called Ian Bremer in New York called the Euro-Asia Group, which is a big think tank. Very, very impressive people. Let's talk about America. Let's talk about North America in general. Let's go to New York and let's talk to Evan Solomon. Evan, how are you? Great to see you.
David, it is so good that you're in Quebec City. What a city. What a great city. Samuel de Champlain, the great foundation where Champlain founded.
Quebec City, it's really, really extraordinary because there's one thing I noticed about it. I was first in Quebec, guys, in the late 1980s. When I had been, and I was, you'd enjoy this, Evan, I was a dishwasher in Ontario Place in Toronto. One of my first of many jobs. Okay.
Wow.
But I went
the first rung on the economic ladder for many,
exactly
many
the first rung on the economic. Don't you ever think it's like going to Harvard or going to Yale or going to Chicago. No, you're washing dishes as an Irish immigrant in Ontario Place. But I decided to go to Montreal. I arrived in Montreal on the day that René Lévesque died. René Lévesque, for Canadians who'll know him, for Irish people, he was like Jerry Adams, Michael Collins, and somebody else all thrown into one. Well, maybe not Jerry Adams. He was the leader of the party.
The political Jerry Adams, the later stage Jerry Adams.
Yeah, exactly. The post-middle-aged Jerry Adams.
That's right.
But one thing I found fascinating here before we talk about America was that in the late 80s, French Canadians, when they spoke English, had a recognizable North American accent. So they sounded like people from Ontario, from Minnesota, to our ears. Right. What is phenomenal after 3 decades of the language policy here is that young French Canadians sound unbelievably French when they speak English. It's like the accent has completely changed. When the linguistic idea that they came up with in the 70s, which you were going to be forced to speak French, has worked, Evan, phenomenally well. Phenomenally well.
It's a fact. Look, one of the commonalities between Quebec and Ireland is in Canada, we had this saying that French and English were the two solitudes. There was a book about it, and economically they were solitudes. They came from different religious traditions, and then, of course, the colonial identity. And there was a great struggle. You mentioned René Lévesque. For our listeners that don't know, in the 1970s in Canada, there was something called the October Crisis, where the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, had to declare the War Measures Act, put tanks on the streets in places like Montreal, because there was a group called the FLQ who were killing people. They killed a guy named Pierre Laporte, and they were lighting off bombs for Quebec separatism. So this was a time, in Ireland, the troubles were going on. In Canada, this was a different level. But this same notion that from the 60s all over the world, the post-colonial era, economically, culturally, intellectually, was happening. It was happening in Quebec. And one of the two consequences, one, in Canada, there were two referenda that on separation, that Canada were going to break up, and it didn't happen. It was a close call. It was a close shave, but it didn't happen. But one of the consequences were the language laws, preserving the language laws. And in Quebec, you had things like Bill 101. These are still controversial bills to make people speak French, to make the signage in French.
Yeah.
And there are still cases today, a lot of them, about infringement on English minority rights laws. And the current governments in Quebec are still, when they're in a pickle, the current government's in a pickle. And what do you do when you're in a pickle? What do you do when you're going to lose an election? You immediately hit the cultural war, language laws.
You go nationalist.
You go nationalist. Does this sound like the British? Does this sound like Ireland, Scotland, Wales? Same stuff. And it's, so you're well at home here.
Yeah, we actually wrote the book, but I was looking at some statistics. We're going to talk about the United States in a sec, but I was looking at some statistics. Between 1829 and 1851, immigrants from the British Isles to Canada, there was 192,000 English people, 74,000 Scots, and 410,000 Irish immigrants came to Quebec, which is phenomenal, or at least entered Canada via Montreal, which is a phenomenal figure.
I mean, Ireland doesn't get credit for populating so many other countries, but we forget. Here I am, about a year and a half living in New York and working here, and I'm, of course, when you move to a new country, you read the history. So I'm in the middle of reading another book about the Civil War. In the lead up to the Civil War, in that very period that you're talking about, when America was rapidly expanding from the 1800s right up to the 1860s, when the Civil War, they had the war with Mexico. Like every 3 years in the 1840s, a new state is coming on. They're expanding westward. And it is a remarkable moment. There's a war eventually to take Texas and California from the Mexicans. Lots going on. The indigenous peoples are literally getting slaughtered as they're pushed away, first off land into reservations and then just killed. But one of the great immigrant streams was the Irish. And the Irish are coming, and they are hated because they're Catholic. And it is shocking to read the tensions that are emerging. North-South tensions are happening, East-West tensions are happening, and Protestant-Catholic tensions are happening, and around a huge wave of immigrants from Ireland. It's fascinating.
Yeah. The thing is that we've done a podcast on a great book by a Canadian scholar called Noel Ignatieff, whose son, Michael Ignatieff, was a serious player in Canada for some time.
I know him well.
Well, his father wrote a great book. John loves it. It's called How the Irish Became White. And it's the history of Irish in New York, Boston, Philadelphia from about 1840 to, let's say, 1900, 1920. Right. And it's about how this race went from being so hated, like the know-nothings. I mean, we're going to talk about Trump in a second. Trump comes from a tradition which was, I think, called the League of the Star-Spangled Banner, otherwise known as the Know-Nothings, who were nativists from the 1850s, largely Scottish and Northern Irish, who really hated the Catholic Irish. And it's the nativist thing. It's what you still get. The hillbillies are basically comes from followers of King Billy from the hills of Appalachia. That's who they were. So we have a great tradition. But let's look at the links between nativism in the 1850s, as you highlighted there, Evan, religious, and let's put in parentheses, cultural struggles, and the nativism on display in, let's say, the Republican Party right now. And I want to just talk about America in this extraordinary year of an election. It's got geopolitical problems. It has threats politically. It has internal threats. It has this culture war. Talk to me. I know, because sometimes when you're slightly outside as a Canadian living in New York, you probably have a better sense of the culture war. You probably better feel for it because you're seeing it with some distance.
Let me say two caveats first. And I want the listeners to know that David and I, where we are, it's not even close to drinking time. Well, John's in Dublin, and so he's already finding this more engaging because he's just happier than we are. But here's my caveat. I'm in New York City, and one of the mistakes people make about the United States is talking about it monolithically. It's a grave mistake. It's so vast. It's so varied. It contains multitudes, to use the great poetic term. And so the idea that you can anything more than descriptively, categorically talk about the United States is a huge mistake. Anyway, then when we talk about any situation, when we're now talking about, Gaza and Israel, pro-Palestine and pro-Israel, these are not helpful categories because there are Palestinians that don't support Hamas, and there's Israelis that don't support Netanyahu. These categories don't help us. So New York City is an island unto itself.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you any great indication of a culture war because, if all of the US was New York City, it would be a totally different, but it's not. It's a vast country. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's not one thing going on. One of the consequences that we've had over the last 20 years with not just social media, the multipolar world that's transformed, is the disaggregation of collective narratives, that we just don't have these narratives.
Yeah.
And so what we have is a series of competing narratives. David, there's a great Canadian thinker named Homer Dixon who years ago defined culture as the set of instructions that one generation passes on to another to tell them how to be.
I like it. And it is a set of instructions.
Yeah. And culture is a set of instructions, economic instructions. How do you think we should do business? Whether on unions, the size of government, how we conduct ourselves, our conventions, who do we accept as people or not? And the culture is a battle between those, in the old days, who has the pen to write the instructions, or now who writes the lines of code, the CEOs, the right, the left, the middle. Well, it turns out that one of the kind of phenomenon is everyone's writing code now.
Yeah.
There's no dominant writer of code. This is not someone's nailing up 99 theses at Wittenberg and all of a sudden, like Martin Luther, we've translated the one big code into the vernacular and at least we'll have access to the same code book. Everyone's got their own code book. And so in the United States, you're seeing a lot of different vectors, codes, and each of them, one of them, you talked about nativism. That's always been a factor. Isolationism, nativism, not unique to the United States, not unique to any country, Ireland, Canada. There's a nativism that is always rides shotgun with any form of nationalism, right? These two are inextricable. I think what's new that we don't talk about here, and in the United States in the 80s, we saw the rise of the Christian evangelical tradition, Jerry Falwell, and how he adhered his very powerful organized Christian right to Ronald Reagan and that kind of Republican evangelical Christian union, and they were bolted together. Now we're seeing something that is, I think, a little more interesting, which is the rise of a kind of Christian nationalism. And you see it on the far right. Guys like Tucker Carlson are really into this stuff. They're importing it from Russia, where Christian nationalism is very much the cornerstone of Vladimir Putin's kind of nationalism, suffusing a kind of strongman, centralized power with a Christian nationalism. And now you're seeing that fuse with a nativism. That, David, is fascinating. And watching where that's going is something that's certainly on my radar screen.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about this Christian nationalism, because again, if you're interested in this sort of carry on, there's a fellow called Dugin, D-U-G-I-N, who is, just for listeners, who's kind of, they call him like Vladimir Putin's intellectual. He's the sort of Robespierre. He's like
Robespierre, yeah.
But let's talk about this, because I know this is something John is interested in too, is Christian nationalism as a force in the United States, as a new force, as a binding force. And it's interesting because Christianism is a very loose term. So you can have Catholics in there, you can have Protestants, you can have evangelicals, you can have Methodists, you can have all sorts, right? It's kind of what they call the strength of weak ties, because the tie is actually quite weak. The bar for being Christian is pretty low. So explain that to me, how you can actually get a
Well,
unified
first of all,
movement.
low bar, but what a great marketing tool. You want low bar. You get more people.
Yeah.
I think you're right. America, the separation of church and state, which I think in Ireland, both of you would have a much more unique perspective on, because it so suffuses how we interact and that kind of close tango that those two forces work within. And then the United States is also very, very distinct. You're in Quebec, where it also has its own distinct dynamic. But in the United States, religion has played a very significant role in the foundation and then later in the Civil War, in really positioning Americans on taking moral positions. But now religion is, in the last 30, 40 years in the United States, is a potent mobilizing force in politics. Christianity is, you cannot win elections in parts of this country without the religious right. And it is remarkably powerful. Probably the most significant event in the last year was the overturning of Roe v. Wade, a long time goal, which is, of course, a Supreme Court decision to legalize abortion in the United States. This has been something that the religious right has seen as their great goal to overturn. Under Donald Trump's appointed Supreme Court, this is his great victory, and animates why people overlook so many of his, I'm going to use a French word here, peccadillos is not a French word, but his other issues, because he got that done. That was, the Waterloo for the right, and, it's a very big deal.
And it's also a very big deal because when you look at it now, I mean, the Trump, again, you want to be living under a rock if you're not following the Stormy Daniels trial. It's like it's manna from heaven, to keep with the religious metaphors. It is manna from heaven for those of us who are slightly voyeuristic about the Trump issue. Let's focus a bit on Trump. How can a man who is so morally corrupted attract any type of people who suspect claim they are religious? I mean, it is something that Europeans can't get our heads around.
It's a fascinating. First of all, Donald Trump himself is a character that we've never seen before. I mean, it's like he's made out of multiple layers of Teflon. I was writing a column the other day that back in 1992 there was a dim-witted vice president named Dan Quayle who went to a school in New Jersey and misspelled the word potato with an E. Yeah. And it solidified his reputation as a dunce and destroyed his political career. Imagine today.
He's Einstein.
If they're misspelling something seems so naive. But look, the culture's changed. It's a crudification of everything and a pornification of everything. Look, Bill Clinton is valorized, but we don't talk about the cigar and the blue dress. So this is not just, we have to be careful just, saying that it is one man that we went, it's paradise lost. And because of what, it's not. Paradise was leaking paradise for generations. And everybody was taking a bite of the apple. So let's just be careful here. I would say, though, that the 5 cent or the threepence explanation that we want him as our president, not our priest, is just crazy. This is part of a larger philosophic question, which is small L liberals, not right left. Let's just talk about small L liberals because you're an economist and you understand. Donald Trump's a manifestation of a certain kind of backlash in the failure of the elevated promises of liberalism to live up to the potential, not only to convince people that their lives will get better, but to prove it. They have to not first believe it. Quality of life doesn't just have to improve. It has to be perceived to be improved, as justice has to be done and perceived to be done. And it's doing neither. And so there are people who think, well, look, I've tried the small L liberal way. Didn't really help me. And I've tried the right way, didn't really help me either. But now Donald Trump's licensed you to stop apologizing and to take back some ability to punch someone in the nose. If you're going to lose, you're going to go down swinging.
Yep.
And this is part of the backlash. And the crisis is not, how is Donald Trump getting over his foibles? I think that on the left, the Democrats and in the United States, but in general, liberals have to understand that the rise of Donald Trump is not just about him as this, how is this Frankenstein political monster? It's reflected on their own inability to talk regularly. And I'll say one last thing. You're in Canada now. Larry Summers, who used to be, he's a great economist. He was president of Harvard. He said, when the United States now tries to deal with countries in Africa where they're battling with the Chinese over the Belt and Road Initiative, and the China's influencing over economic investments there. And he said, a lot of people say, when we talk to the United States now, we get a lecture. When we talk to the Chinese, we get a bridge.
Yeah.
And the small L liberals have been lecturing people for a long time. It doesn't mean they're wrong about corrective and inclusion. They may be right on a lot of things.
Yep.
But, it's like the kid who's always got their hand up in the front of the class. They may be right all the time, but no one in the class.
They piss you off.
They piss you off. They get punched in the nose in the yard. It was like, wait, I was right. I studied. I did all my homework. It's like, good for you. You have no friends.
So small L liberals have talked their way into getting on people's nerves. It's really interesting. At the moment, I'm reading a book by Barbara Kingsolver called Damon Copperhead.
I read it.
Isn't it amazing?
Fantastic.
I'm reading it at the moment because when I try to travel, I always try to travel with a book that is kind of the moment, right? And it's basically about a kid in Appalachia based broadly on David Copperfield, the story, but amazing. But what it really hits home to us is the atrophying of the white working class in the United States. These people who, as you said, are going to go down swinging if they're going to go down. And they're sick of being told they're dumb. And Trump gives them permission to say, screw you, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. That book, by the way, I'm interrupting. It's a fascinating book. Bloody depressing in some ways. Brilliant book. It is also a meditation on the poverty in America that Americans don't talk about. Of all the things we talk about, the horse race and the Stormy Daniels and the porn, one of the topics I notice here we don't talk about, it used to be a key issue 50 years ago, is poverty. Literacy rates are low. One of the things about Damon Copperfield, the Barbara Kingsolver book, is it's about poverty. It's about the poverty that was hot-wired by opioids. So it's like as if you made poverty not just a fatal social illness, but then you actually put a bullet in it and made it literally an assassination weapon because of opioids. And so you really see this hyper-accelerated destruction at the core of the working class and the poor U.S., and it is a devastating portrait that we are ignoring at our peril, economically, socially, culturally, and that is part of the fuel of the backlash.
By the way, if you're interested, the book is Damon Copperhead. It is well worth a read. Okay, but let's talk about what it suggests. So you're saying kind of opioids weaponizing poverty weaponizing opioids, creating this extraordinary, but in terms of people, millions of people in an underclass situation. To what extent, and I know that, big macro thinkers are always talking about the moment when you signal a culture is atrophying, a culture is coming to its peak. 40 years ago, when I was, or nearly 40 years, when I was in Ontario, when I was working away in Ontario Place as a fantastically well-adjusted dishwasher.
We still talk about that time as some of the cleanest dishes in Ontario. I've never understood it. And now I understand why we had that time.
Well, it was a sort of a maxed out detergent sort of operation that I was running in the back of the thing. But that was the beginning of what people would have described as Pax America. Late 1980s, we mentioned Ronald Reagan. The wall comes down, the Washington Consensus, America's top dog, it's setting the rules, and it's the big swinging dick knocking around the world, right? And lots of countries, particularly countries like Ireland, did very, very well under its protection. Are we seeing that era coming to an end? And if so, what comes next?
I think that era was still defined by the United States as the organizing principal power, the hyperpower, the superpower. And so Pax Americana was really, lets everyone align with the globalization views of the United States. And the American empire was not an empire like the British Empire of old. It was an empire of economics where they essentially were the cop on the beat on all the shipping routes. They guarded it. And in return for making sure that, Somali pirates don't take over, or Houthis don't, shoot rockets like they're doing right now, countries will organize around a series of trade issues, and you'll be able to shop at Walmart and get your stuff for cheap. And for all the criticisms of globalization, and there are many, the stats are overwhelming. We've lifted up millions of people out of poverty in many, many, many parts of the world, China included, by the way, and all the tiger nations in Asia, and of course in Ireland as well, right?
Yep.
Which the term you coined yourself. So the Celtic tiger.
Somebody claimed I coined, but I didn't.
Do you not even take it? God, have you learned nothing about the Trump trials? Just take it. but I think now we're long past that. And, the rise of China, from the G7 to the G20, it's a multipolar world. And it's a more dangerous world. And the question that of our time is, what will the organizing principle be? And you've been in this debate. I followed your debate on Israel-Gaza is a little microcosm where you're trying to take a stand on, people have very passionate views on this kind of thing. But the question is, in the moment, it's taking a stand against or for someone. Let's not debate that. But what is the world in the end that we want? Who do we want as the cops on the beat? What is the long-term organizing principle? For all the criticisms of America, post-war America, it's been a pretty good organizing principle. Not perfect. This is not, I'm not an American apologist, but you got to say what the options are. I spent a year living in Hong Kong. Do you want China to be the organizing principle? Think carefully before you answer. For those African countries, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, who are taking huge cheap loans from America, you thought the IMF structural adjustment loans were bad? Just you wait, right? Like, be careful what's out there, because nothing ever works. One of the things you want is a system of recourse and response. And in the one thing about the United States, about Europe, is when things go wrong, there's an option. It's called an election. When things go wrong in China, you get billed for the bullet. So it's a totally different system. So I think the Pax Americana is under threat. Post-war small liberal institutions that we've all benefited from in many ways are eroding, some for the good, some for the bad. We don't need to go into all of it. But on the whole, they're deeply under threat by cynicism, distrust, bad actors, disinformation, new technology, AI. Hey, man, we are in the most important time in our lives since the Second World War in terms of what do we want? And the structure is under threat. And I'm fascinated to hear where we go.
Evan, a tour de force, my friend, a tour de force. Listen, would you come back on and hang with us?
Listen, I married into a woman with all Irish roots. My grandmother was an Irish American from Cavan County. So listen, I can bullshit with the best of them. This is it.
Evan, listen, wonderful to talk to you. Brilliant stuff. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you so much.
David, it is absolutely a pleasure. Great to connect. And John, raise a glass for both of us. I know you're doing it now.
I sure will. Mark, you got to get Evan over to Kilkenomics. He was superb.
Definitely.
He was superb. But what he was talking about at the end there, it was essentially what Neil Howe was talking about, the fourth turning, when he was saying, what do we want at the end? Where do we want to be? Who do we want as cops? Who do we want as the organizing force, as a global organizing force, given that America has had its day and don't want that mantle anymore?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the end is kind of careful what you wish for, is that we may well miss America when she's gone. That's the idea. It's very, very easy to criticize, particularly now with certainly the Middle East, right? I mean, people have taken sides, and I think rightly so. But in a new world order where America becomes the subservient power to China and China is the bankroller and economic muscle behind Russia. What we have, and the global South, as he said, we don't want a lecture, we want a bridge, and the Chinese are giving us bridges, but they haven't figured out that, the small print is China will be the IMF of the world. And it might be a very, very different player at the end of the day. But I think what we're talking about, John, and you do get that feeling, is that we are at, is it a fourth turning? Is it eighth turning? Is it the end of something? It feels that way. When you look at American culture internally, and when you see American power externally, and when you see the fact that America has been threatened by China, maybe by India, by Russia, all these things, and you understand that the Americans are kind of fed up of being the policeman. The one thing about the States is, and I think Evan put his finger on it, is, North America in general. I'm looking at the window of this hotel. The St. Lawrence River or Saint Laurent River, right? It is like a sea in itself, John. It has tides, it has currents, it's enormous. And you get that sense of the vastness of America, but also you get that sense of the isolation of America. That, with the two big oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic, cutting them off from everything. They're self-sufficient in food, they're self-sufficient in energy. They don't need to be involved in the world, really, if they don't want to be involved in the world. And it's the one major power that has a land border, obviously, with Canada, where they're good mates, and with Mexico, where they are still friends. It has big powers in Latin America. You just think, what if the Americans just shut up shop? What if they just say, we've had a while, but that empire's over. We're going to go back to the isolationism, to ourselves, to protectionism. Then the world, John, is a very, very different place.
But it's interesting that when you talk about the vastness of America, that really struck me when back in 92 or whatever it was, I did that drive from San Francisco to New York on my own, which was one of the best trips I ever did. But it took me 10 days, 10 full days. And it was fantastic. And when you're in the middle of America and you're stopping off, and I've talked to lots of people as you do, and there is a kind of a dislocation of these people, what's going on in the rest of the world. And they've no need almost to know about it.
Yeah.
But I thought it was really interesting what he mentioned about, this rise of Christian nationalism almost having its roots in Russia. But as you say, when you're in this period of uncertainty, which we are, there is a rise of anxiety and all sorts of extremism comes out of that.
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do, John. I'll tell you what we'll do, right? Because it is interesting that Putin's model has been a combination of the Romanovs and the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
And his intellectual, I call him Robespierre, but maybe Rasputin is this guy, Alexander Dugin. And I think what we will do is we'll do a podcast on Dugin and the economics and politics of Russian fundamentalist Christianity and how it has enveloped the likes of Tucker Carlson. This is where these people are coming from.
Yeah.
Big voices in America are enamored with Putin. They like it. They like the security. They like the safety.
MTG
they like the big man,
and the likes.
The big man machoism of the whole thing. And in a way, what Evan was saying was that small L liberals have, by continuously lecturing people, have actually given the rise of Christian nationalism a foothold. And it makes sense. And it's very white, and it's very irredentist, and it is also an ideology that could allow America to go back in upon itself. And I'll tell you what, if the Americans leave the stage, God knows who's going to take their place.
And we won't have a say.
Irish, we certainly won't have a say. At this stage, we've got a bowl of shamrock and St. Patrick's Day. That's a say, at least it's something. Imagine going to Beijing with a bowl of shamrock. How are you doing, Xi? What's the crack? Anyway, we'll talk to you tomorrow or the next day.